chocolate, and the dancing shadows are, in themselves, enough. Here I am. Why waste time wanting to be somewhere else? Join me by the campfire.
Hello, everybody. I am Aaron Simmons, and this is another episode of Campfire Philosophy with J. Aaron Simmons. Thank you all so much for being with us. I should say out of the gate tonight, this is a recorded episode because my distinguished guests, it turns out, are so busy and so in demand that they could not do Monday night. So we have recorded this a couple days beforehand. That said, if any of you have questions, comments, thoughts, please drop them in on one of the streaming platforms. I will do my absolute best to be responding to you in real time, since I will watch the live stream and then interact with any comments as they come in. But just in case you're wondering why the comments aren't going to show up on the video, that's what's going on. This is recorded a couple days before it goes live. So thank you all again for being here. I am joined by the campfire tonight by two amazing scholars and activists and practitioners, people who are living the debates that we're going to think through tonight. This is Mike Austin, a philosopher who has a new book forthcoming, in fact, on the topic of tonight, which is Christian nationalism. And so, Mike, it is so great to have you here. Let me make sure to tell people, go check out your forthcoming book. They can pre-order it, American Christian Nationalism, Neither American Nor Christian. Great title. Thanks so much, Mike, for being with us.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Oh, it's going to be a lot of fun. Mike also has done an enormous amount of other work on humility, has a book about conspiracy theories and religious orientations, which I actually contributed to. I'm convinced that's why it was not a New York bestseller. It was like, oh, that guy, and it immediately went down the sales list. But he also did a really influential book about God and guns in America. So here's a link to Mike's website. Please go check it out. Our other guest tonight by the campfire is Elizabeth Neumann, who is an expert in all things homeland security and extremist groups. She has worked with the Department of Homeland Security for several administrations and has been Deputy Chief of Staff to the Homeland Security Secretary. So Elizabeth just published a new book. It just came out April, I think, a couple months ago, called Kingdom of Rage: The Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. So Elizabeth, it is truly an honor to have you with us tonight.
I am delighted to join the campfire conversation. I can't wait to see where this goes.
Well, as long as none of us end up getting burned at the stake, we will do well. And so our topic tonight simply is, what is Christian nationalism and why is it such a present concern? It's a thing that is continuing to get lots of traction, a lot of media attention. And it's an old idea, and yet an idea that is kind of resurfacing as contemporarily relevant and in lots of different ways. And so that's why I thought it would be cool to have two philosophers thinking about this, and then also somebody working on the ground in what this looks like as a policy issue, so that it's not just abstract, it's, you know, taking theory and practice and putting them together. So let's just start off, Elizabeth. Why is it that Christian nationalism is something you thought deserved a book from you? Like, why is it that's the thing now that you thought was worth writing a book on?
So the actual book that I wrote was about extremism, and nationalism is one form of extremism that we get worried about. And I think it's an increasingly more prevalent form of extremism in the United States. Arguably, the Christian nationalism of the past was not necessarily extremist in nature. And we are moving into a time and space where the advocacy for violence as a way to solve our political disagreements is it's more and more widely embraced. There's 32% of Americans who believe that violence is sometimes justified in order to achieve your political ideas or agenda. That is 84 million people in the country. Wow. We have 800,000 law enforcement officers in this country. And you can see from right there, like, there's just no way that security policy or security forces can address a problem of 84 million potentially violent people. Now, the good news is that most people do not move to violence. It's a cognitive opening that they hypothetically think is plausible. But I would argue that with 84 million people, that's just too large of a number, and too many people who talk about how civil war is maybe something we should be doing, or violence is maybe justified. And that then inspires a very small percentage of people that will go commit an act of violence. So having conversations, responsible conversations about the dangers of certain types of extremism, whether it's white supremacy or anti-government extremism or nationalist extremism, it's important for people to understand that when you move to that space of being open to violence as a solution, even if you personally don't really mean it, you are possibly inspiring somebody else. And just the statistics alone of the last 10 years, our trajectory has been pretty sky high since 2015 in terms of the number of mass attacks, school shootings, political violence, hate crimes, like all of it's off the charts. And in my mind, having looked at this for the last 3 years, it kind of comes back to a fractured, polarized society who is increasingly unwilling to see their political opponent as human. They increasingly demonize and view the other as evil. And it's creating this space for people to think, okay, well, I guess I need to maybe be willing to fight, and as opposed to what the concept of democracy is, which is sure, fight at the ballot box, but not like physically fight, right? Like we've just kind of gotten to this place where there are too many people that are open to this suggestion that actual violence is how we solve our problems.
So is that your conception of extremism? Because one of the things that philosophers, of course, get very touchy about, right, is, well, words are slippery things. Martin Heidegger has this great line where he says, all the really good words have been used up long ago. So when we talk about extremism, it could be the case that holding a view that is simply not part of the mainstream, or it's further, in a degree than most people hold, would count as extreme. So, for example, if Mike was a substance dualist, that would actually be, I would suggest, Mike, an extremist view for contemporary philosophical metaphysics. But it sounds like, Elizabeth, your notion is the willingness to consider violence as a reasonable outcome of one's views is what constitutes extremism. Does that sound right? Or how would you nuance that?
I completely agree. Extremism is a contextual term, and depending on where you're applying it, you could argue Jesus was an extremist. He was way outside the mainstream of his Jewish culture at the time by not wanting to fight Rome, right? Like, so being outside of the mainstream is not necessarily bad. And you could look throughout history, and there are things that we practice today, views we hold dear, like freedom of speech, that would have been like way outside the mainstream, crazy, radical, extreme, right? So you're right. It is a contextual term. And in the context of national security, the definition I use is J.M. Berger coined, he did a little book called Extremism for MIT's Essentials. And he has this definition that says extremism is when an in-group perceives a threat to their success or survival by an out-group, and that there is no other solution but hostile action. So the two pieces of this are a threat to your success or survival. And I think one of the challenges of our moment is that all of our politics is framed that way. There is no scenario where, well, if the other guy wins, it's we'll fight another 4 years from now. Everything is existential. We're going to lose democracy. We're going to lose our country as we know it. You're not going to be able to protect your kids. It's everything is my success or survival is on the line right now with our politics. It becomes extremist when the solution is not, well, I'm going to vote, or I'm going to go tell all my neighbors to vote, or I'm going to go give money to my campaign of choice. But the solution is hostile action. And hostile action is a spectrum. On the lower end of the spectrum are things like intimidation, bullying, threats, which largely are not criminal. They can sometimes be criminally prosecuted, but it's hard. Typically, we deal with that in the civil society or civil courts. But then you move into a criminal space, and maybe it's property damage or, graffiti, hate crimes. But then the hate crimes can go past the property and become targeted violence towards individuals, mass attacks, including terrorism, and then genocide being the upper end of that spectrum. And of course, most people who might embrace this ideology of hostile action is necessary are never going to move to that criminal space. It's a very small percentage, but I think we have a pretty sizable number of people that are operating in that lower end of the hostile action space. And it's like a funnel. You start on the lower end, and then you make progressive steps. Like you're going through a cognitive process of, am I doing enough for the cause? And if a leader or propaganda you see online challenges you, and there's some other factors here we're not talking about yet, but basically you go through this questioning of yourself. Am I doing enough for the cause? And if the answer is no, then you elevate. And the more people we have elevating, the easier it is to get to the criminal space, which arguably we kind of saw during the Trump administration as it pertains towards immigrants, towards people of color. It created a permission structure for people to act on the sentiments that they were hearing from a pretty large platform of the presidency. And it's not that the president ever had to say, go commit a hate crime or go commit a mass attack. It's that he creates this permission structure that you can bully, you can intimidate, you can do these non-criminal things, and that somehow that's okay. And by creating that permission structure, you're bringing more people onto that pipeline, and a small percentage will eventually progress to the criminal behavior. So the message of the book is, we need to wake up. We actually have quite a significant problem in the country with the number of people that are engaging in that hostile action spectrum, the number of people that are cognitively open to the idea that violence is how we solve our problems, in part because government can't solve this. We really have to reassert civil society norms, and that requires normal people who generally think like, why would anybody go commit an act of violence? Like, that's crazy. Like, most normal people have a hard time seeing the evil for what it is. And so trying to wake up to the fact that, no, we have a problem. And if you don't do anything, the problem's going to get worse. But you can do some really basic things to reassert norms in our society of how we treat one another and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable behavior, not because it's criminal, but because it's just not how we should be treating one another as fellow human beings. And over time, reasserting those norms will start to reduce the violence in the country.
That makes a lot of sense. So, Mike, when I hear Elizabeth's description of this, it makes me think two things in political philosophy terms that I want to get your take on, because on the one hand, all of what Elizabeth just said sounds in a, like, if you just, wrinkle your face enough on a Thursday, it sounds a lot like Michael Walzer's defense of just war theory. If you find yourself with an imminent and radical threat, right, and it risks what he calls the death of a community, then this justifies all kinds of behavior, in this case violence, that would in other cases maybe not be warranted. So I'm not at all suggesting, right, that contemporary Christian nationalism or religious extremism fits the just war model. But I do think there's an interesting logic when you create the divisive rhetoric that says they are not just dangerous to our vision of social, flourishing, but they are evil, immoral, repugnant, morally reprobate, right? They will end what matters for myself and my children. That sounds a lot like a fear about a death of a community, and narrating it in kind of ratcheting up those terms, it becomes imminent, severe, like all these check boxes that we would normally deploy relative to things like just war theory. It sounds like that part of the permission structure is also that the language of opposition, the radical divisiveness, actually creates a space where they might be able to justify their views on a model that would, I would say, tacitly reject such extremism as wildly unjust. And yet it's like we've distorted the norms so deeply that now we're using the very frameworks to justify the thing that those frameworks were meant to oppose.
Mhm.
So how is it that we can kind of find our way through this morass of twisted logic because of radical social division?
Yeah, that is a good question.
I'm so glad he
Uh,
gave that one to you.
Yeah, read Elizabeth's book. No, um, no. I mean, I think about this, and as a philosopher, so one thing I appreciate about Elizabeth is just what we would just call empirical. Like, oh, here's what's happening on the ground, right? Not just armchair stuff. But
She
for
gave
me,
us
like,
numbers,
yeah,
man.
that's
Like
right. She didn't make them up.
84 million. I'm like, a
Yeah,
lot of people think a
yeah.
thing.
But I think, I've struggled with this because I think, I didn't, so my little short book that's coming out, I didn't want to write it. And in fact, I say this at the start, I don't want to write this book. I didn't want to spend time reading this stuff from kind of advocates of certain kinds of American Christian nationalism. But I thought there's some big books about it, but what would it, like if somebody at church or at the office or whatever says, I don't know what this is, should I be a nationalist or a patriot? I've had these conversations with people. And so it's
Right.
short. So I guess I'm saying a lot to say whether that or other books or just online resources or someone that that knows this stuff that you trust. It starts small. Like it means like, so if it's your neighbor or your brother or uncle or parent or child that start like going in these directions, then it's those kind of conversations. So that's where the ideas matter for sure, because ideas are a part of this. But then as we know, we're not purely rational beings. We have a will, we have desires, emotions, all that stuff that gets mixed up in it. And I think some of these questions about identity. So for me, it's those kind of deeper human needs that undergird some of this, that philosophers have things that we all have things to say about. But as a philosopher, I try to approach it that way. What are the ideals that are worth hanging on to? And so, I mean, some of the communities I'm in, I'm a I'm a Christian professor at a public university. I do work in like Christian philosophy societies, so I've got like I can be talking to the most like committed hardcore atheist one day and like someone who's got Jerry Falwell's politics the next day. It's just kind of a weird mix. And I think my concern is the kind of things that Elizabeth talked about. Like I hear people say that, like, well, Democrats are evil. And I told another philosophy professor in a different part of the country on Facebook, this was a while ago, that I would, if my choice was between I'll just say it, between Trump and Biden back then, I was like, well, I'm not really happy with either, but if that's my choice, I'll vote for Biden. And then the reply wasn't why, it was, Mike, why do you hate America? So that's exact. And this is someone with a PhD in philosophy, right? And so my understanding of the Christian nationalist research, it doesn't matter, and conspiracy theories, and maybe Elizabeth can speak to the extremism stuff. Someone like me, like we, because we're academics, well, people that buy that stuff, they're just not that smart or they're not educated. And, that's an easy out. And then we can feel superior or whatever, but it's just not true. I mean, it's just like, it's all the way from people that are way smarter than any of us, more educated, to the person who isn't. And it doesn't, that's just stuff doesn't matter. And I think that's important. Right. So whatever that means, but I just, I mean, the kind of stuff I've done the past several years here, I'm trying to like, let's find this common ground. And we're, I was alive. I mean, I'm 55, so I remember the 80s and Reagan, and, there's the kind of the story, Reagan and Tip O'Neill would go at it, but then they'd like go out for a drink or for dinner, but you're not going to see like, Mitch McConnell and Kamala Harris go out for, or Pelosi. So that's what worries me. It's like there's the American identity that tied us all together. And of course we've had stresses and strains on that, and it's never been this ideal thing, but it's just a change. Like I don't sense that in the rhetoric and even the attitudes. And people who would call themselves committed patriots, committed religious believers, they're doing these same kind of things, the sort of dehumanizing rhetoric, and it's really troubling to me. So I think one thing is not falling prey to it. And it's, especially in art, it's easy to do because it's take those cheap shots and just go at people. And if you're naturally, a little bit sarcastic and cynical, like my middle school football coach called me Austin the Cynic. And of course, I thought that was cool then. Now I think I don't want to be a cynic. But it's just a temptation. So it's tough, but I think it starts in those relationships, and then for the ways that we can influence more broadly. What it doesn't have to be a book, or it can be the Campfire Philosophy, or just in our network. It's going to take just people being more human to one another in that normative sense.
Yeah.
And that just means it starts with me, right, and you, and it's not we're the problem, right, and.
Right.
Or at least, or we can, if we're not the problem, we can at least do small things to help move the needle the other way over time.
Well, which is what your work on humility, I think, helps with. Yeah. Elizabeth.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that, to quote the great philosopher Taylor Swift.
Yeah.
Me, I'm the problem.
Yeah. Good.
I just scored points with my 10-year-olds.
That's good.
That's it, right. A whole new audience has just opened up to Campfire Philosophy.
Well, yeah. If we're quoting our favorite musicians, mine is "There Is No Them, There's Only Us," song by U2, and I think there's something. It's a song called "Invisible," but there's something deep about that. So, because I think as someone who's a person of Christian faith, and I see like the way that other Christians are treating people who share their faith or don't, and it's just, we've got all these differences, but a lot of different sort of wisdom traditions have different ways of saying this, but for me, it's like, no, there is no them, and we're all human beings made, bearing God's image, and sort of my view. So that's that we're united at that deepest level, and we've lost that.
Yeah. I was just today writing a chapter for a new book that I'm co-authoring on organizational leadership and culture creation. And the chapter is all about the way in which, as you put it, Mike, like we fall prey to certain types of assumptions operative within our broader communities, right? And one of the things that I was talking about in this chapter, and I think is relevant to what we're discussing here, is that this falling prey, which again is drawing on Martin Heidegger's account of how our sense of identity is something that always already finds its level when we take certain things for granted. And one of the ways in which things are easiest for us, like this is part of why, Elizabeth, I tend to think we are drawn to extremist views, whether that means, proclivities to violence or just something outside the norm. We're excited about something outside the norm because the us with whom we identify is sexier than just the, pop culture mainstream, right? And so I actually drew on Kendrick Lamar's new track, Dissing Drake, where he says, "They not like us." And I was saying, notice like the worst insult that Kendrick can level is that dude's a poser. He's not one of us, right? There's also an extreme metal band called Nails that has an album or some mixes that "You'll Never Be One of Us." And this idea of the sense that we've got to belong. I've got to find a way to be part of this community. For me, this is where the religious dynamic is so important as like the adjectival descriptor of extremism or nationalism. That when we bring religious affiliation, the us is a religious group, and we bring that to bear on the us in some sort of social grouping, that what the religious modifier does is makes the us not just people who are Florida State fans, which I am, or people who drive lifted trucks, which I do. Like whatever, there's all kinds of groupings that exist that don't carry eternal significance relative to the substrate of moral reality. But as soon as we introduce some God talk in there, the "they not like us" is not just, hey, we disagree and this is why we should have good conversations. They are now oppositionally framed as not just social enemy, but theological enemy. And for me, that's where I get very confused about the best way forward. Because Mike, you see me on social media do this a lot. Like I will deploy religious reasons. I'll deploy biblical arguments. I'll deploy all kinds of things that gain traction in this community to whom I'm trying to speak. And the fact that I'm doing this to then try to help them rethink some view, the view needing rethought, nope, you're now just misunderstanding the Bible. And I'm always like, well, shoot, let's have that conversation. That's about hermeneutics. Let's do that work. But we can't, because if I disagree about the social policy, I necessarily am wrong about the theology. And that's where I just don't know how you start making inroads, though I, like both of you, try daily. I think that's where the religious us, they not like us, means they now are theologically problematic to the point where we must stand against the wolf in the henhouse. So, Elizabeth, do you find this religious dynamic to exacerbate, deepen, like, what is it that being religious does? Because there's plenty of non-religious extremists, right?
There are.
What is it that the religious stuff does to make that us so intractable?
So it is, of all the extremisms that have taken form in hundreds of years, the ones that are the most deadly are those that are inspired by religion. So the most lethal, the most deadly, there's a religious nexus. You can make the argument, and I do in the book, that the white supremacist extremist threat that we have been dealing with for well over 100 years, that that was wrapped in the cross, right? Like literally the Ku Klux Klan used the cross to burn, to terrify former slaves in the post or in the Reconstruction period, and then Jim Crow South. So there's a co-opting of religious symbols in various extremist movements, white supremacy being one of the most primary examples, but also in the anti-government extremist movement, they use religion for that. And then you have things that are more kind of weird, purely religious, like Christian identity, but Christian identity is also kind of racist, anti-Semitic. So like, is it more anti-Semitism, or is it really pure religiously motivated? The reality is, for those of us that have been working in the counterterrorism space, particularly after 9/11, we really hyper-focused on ideology. Like, if we can just crack this nut and figure out why people are attracted to it, then we can count. Like, for a long time, it was, we should counter message. Like, here's how to debunk that ideology. And we tried it for a long time, and turns out that doesn't work.
As if ideology is just a matter of branding. Like, that's a,
like, if you can just
problematic move. Yeah.
Right. If you can just explain, especially for the religious motivated stuff, we were doing this with Al-Qaeda, right? Like, we asked moderate Muslims, please stand up and push back against this idea that jihad is a violent thing. Make jihad, to explain your scriptures to show how it's not violent. And a lot of moderate Muslims did that. And I don't mean to suggest that that wasn't a noble effort. It's just that if somebody's already radicalized, it doesn't change their mind. Now, it does help. It's kind of the inoculation theory of conspiracy theories and extremism. If you can introduce a bit of the conspiracy theory or the extremist ideology to somebody who is not radicalized, and explain to them why it's not correct, then it does actually build a protective factor if they're ever exposed to it in the wild, so to speak. So there is value to counter messaging, but it's not in addressing those that are already radicalized. What we have learned is that if once somebody has bought into that ideology, when you are having a conversation with them, even if you're gentle and kind in how you do it, they are going to dig in. You are attacking their identity and having some sort of conversation to try to prove that they're wrong. So what we have learned is that the way you approach somebody that is radicalized is you need to be seeking for what are the underlying psychosocial causes that led them to be open to that ideology in the first place. And that this is really kind of the game-changing understanding in the last 10 years in the field is that it's not the ideology that radicalizes. It's some unmet need that left them open. It's often activated by like a life crisis, a loss of a job or a loved one, a humiliation. It can be a group humiliation, which I think is kind of what's happening to the Christian community in the United States. It can also be an individual humiliation. And having some sort of crisis moment then creates you to be open to that ideology. That ideology is solving a problem, an unmet need. The top two needs are a need for belonging and a need for significance.
Yeah. They not like us. That's
yes,
right. It
exactly.
gives us a sense of purpose.
So if you are engaging with somebody using scripture and you are not meeting their box of like, nope, you're not one of us, right? Like your engagement to them subconsciously is it appeals to them in a way that you're attacking their identity. So you're never going to persuade them, because it's not really about the persuasion. It's not really about the argument or whatever conversation's happening. It's like, this is you are attacking their personhood, because they have placed what I would argue only God can handle in terms of our identity. They've hung their identity in a political tribe or in some sort of moral system of this is what it means to be a true Christian, which, by the way, I don't know, spent several hours listening to Tim Keller expound on Galatians and just getting drilled into my head again. Like, no, it's not the law. If we're living by the law, then we've lost the point of the gospel. So you just, when we run into those people, the most impactful thing you can do is to just love them. They're not going to change today because of your love or your empathy, but someday down the road, maybe when they have that another moment in their life where they're like, this is not actually meeting my needs. I don't feel like I belong, or I don't feel safer or more secure, or whatever issue they were grappling with in the first place. You become the safe person that they might reach out and engage with, and might be in a place where they can start to unpack why they were so misled in the first place. But that's a hard message, right? Especially if it's somebody you personally know and you love, and they're just in this really dark space where they might even view you as evil, right? Like I've have some friends and family members that when in 2020 I said I wasn't voting for Trump, people were like, oh my gosh, you've walked away from the faith. And you're like, how are those two things connected? But it was very connected for them. And that is, so it's painful to be perceived as somehow being against them. Like, you're like, that it's not about you. Like, I love you. I still want you in my life. You're still my family member, my friend, just because we disagree on politics. But no, they can't see it that way. And so it's a very painful place to be with people who are trapped and their identity being totally wrapped up in this ideology.
Yeah. So I do want to come back in the second half of the show to think about practical solutions and practical steps, because you're both hinting at there's got to be some sort of non-policed human encounter that starts correcting for this, right? So I want to return to that. But Mike, I want to ask you, because this connects to your new book, about this ideological facet that Elizabeth's putting on the table. So I actually don't know this about you, Mike, but if you have read much Slavoj Zizek, not exactly something that happens a lot in analytic phil religion spaces, but Zizek has this interesting book called The Fragile Absolute, where the subtitle is basically, or why the Christian legacy is worth fighting for. And he goes on in that book, and this is Elizabeth, there's no reason you should know him. He did run for like the president of the Czech Republic or something for a while.
Oh, very cool.
There's a YouTube video of him like in some debate, and it shows why philosophers should never run for office. I mean, it's an absolute effing disaster. Like, his opponents are giving these great sound bites that could turn into t-shirts, and he starts like quoting Lacan and stuff. It's hilarious. But Zizek says in that book, the Christian legacy is worth fighting for someone like him who is a Marxist, psychoanalytic, Leninist sort of political radical who has no interest in theism, but he loves Christianity and what it stands for. And he says it's too important to let the fundamentalists have it.
Oh,
And the reason is he thinks it has such revolutionary potential to create a society based on something, like we might say, an ideology of love, rather than an ideology of scarcity and competition, or, you know, other capitalistic goods that, you know, he would be worried about. So, Mike, in your book, you say American Christian nationalism, neither Christian nor American. Like, it fails at both of the things it claims to be. So what is it about this ideological thing we call, I think I'm not suggesting religion just is ideology, but the term, the concept Christianity, the term, the concept America, are certain ideological framings for all kinds of lived realities. So what is it that you are suggesting when you say that American Christian nationalism is not Christian and it's not actually American? What is the ideological work you're doing? Because I think it's sort of like Zizek saying, this is too important to let those guys have it.
Yeah, for sure. That's part of it. And for me, it's, you know, because I think it's, look, we all come to it. You know, the older I get, the more I see, oh, I had the blind spot here about, like, I know this verse in Matthew never challenged me. And then it's like I'd never read it before. I'm like, oh, wait, I've just become more attuned to the ways that I have, and I know other people do, just, well, it can't mean that, so then just kind of go on, right? But maybe it actually does mean that, you know. But I think, like, you know, there's a pluralism to it, right? I'm not trying to, like, say here's the American way and the Christian way, right? I don't have the authority nor ability to discern that. But I think there are some things that are a part of whatever that we should all have in common, right? So for America, you know, I mean, this is actually from Tom Morris's book, The Everyday Patriot. I just borrowed some of those ideals. So liberty, equality. I talk about service and how those are American values, right, in our documents and just historically. And then I just take stuff from the books written by Christian nationalists that that say, like, there won't be freedom of religion if we get our way. And if a Muslim tries to convert a Christian, like they're actually trying to make someone who's a Christian become a Muslim, not make, but like just through dialogue, well, they can be put in jail or in principle executed. I mean, now I'm like, that's just, yeah. And you say that, but it's when they write it, you know, it's not like I'm making it up. Equality is one, right? So there's a lot of stuff about gender, and you know, some of these guys are online, and in a Christian America, women wouldn't have the right to vote, you know, stuff like that. And and it's easy just to kind of roll your eyes at until you see more and more people like, yeah, that's right. You know, I'm just like, so equality. And, you know, they want a religious test for political office, which it's Article 6 of the Constitution, 7, one of the, I quote it in the book, you know, right through, but there's not supposed to be. And service, that's the thing where, you know, I try to make this point. I'm very non-polemical in the book. I'm just, and I think that's a virtue of it, in the sense that it's not like a hit piece, but I'm still arguing for something. But I think, like, if you think about the history of our country, yeah, there's tons of bad stuff, of course, and you can tell that story, and that's part of the story. But even our military has done incredible humanitarian things around the world in history. Things, you know, things that Americans have done with our money. I mean, think about in the 2000s, George W. Bush and the stuff with AIDS. You know, the PEPFAR. I mean, Americans have done those kind of things. Like, part of being American, I think many people have realized over the decades and centuries, the incredible resources we have, and we've done sometimes a pretty good job at sharing those, right? We could do a lot more. I mean, but yeah, so I think, so the ideology is part of it. But yeah, even in the first chapter of the book, I do what analytic philosophers don't like to do. I say, I'm not going to give you like an airtight definition of American Christian nationalism, because I don't know if you can. I say, here's some things it's not just being conservative Christian or bringing your religious views to bear in political life. It's more about, I mean, there are a lot of things, but two things that stand out to me are this notion of taking dominion, like gets taken from Genesis to and translated, and then Matthew 28 about making disciples of all the nations. Those things are taken to be, well, we're going to do that by taking over our nation, and well, at least our nation, right? So it's done through political power, which I'm pretty sure that's not correct.
Well, do you run into people, and this is a terminological distinction, but it's one that I don't know if the term has the traction that I think it should. So typically, the people who would be defending what you're describing as this American Christian nationalism would take themselves to be the greatest defenders of liberty and equality and justice in the American way, and they are the true Democrats, right? They are this is what democracy looks like. But of course, definitionally, what you've just said about that perspective and that set of views is this is theocratic politics. Like definitionally, it's anti-democratic. And not in some sort of controversial way, right? Like this isn't like a hard sell where we're trying to be really nuanced. It's in a democracy, as John Rawls suggests, the political philosopher, the fact of reasonable pluralism is simply one of the epistemic starting points. You start by saying, we will disagree not just about policy, but about the good. We will disagree about fundamental commitments about who persons are. That's why we've got to have some political conceptions, right? Like even if you're a complementarianism about gender, that doesn't mean that then that plays out as a view about who gets the vote. Our political conception of the person is radically equal. So if democracy requires this kind of as Rob Talese, political philosopher, puts it, this ideal of a self-governing society anchored in the fact, the empirical reality that part of that community is disagreement about the good. When people come in and say, no, the only way we can truly live into our democratic commitments is to enforce one conception of the good, and it's going to be a theocratic vision of the good, that's anti-democratic. I mean, is there any traction? Like, I would think they just respond and say, okay, screw democracy. Like be consistent and just own that. But that's not what I tend to see. I tend to see them saying, no, you're distorting. And then they introduced what I would suggest is a myth of Christianity and America are two sides of the same coin. This is where we get, Greg Boyd, of course, who has written some great stuff about the myth of the Christian nation. And so their conception of democracy is so distorted that they don't actually see theocracy as an anti-democratic view. Does that resonate, or am I missing something? Like that's my experience, but it may be anecdotal, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a similar spectrum in the way that the 84 million. Like there's a group of guys, white guys mainly, not exclusively, but like saying this kind of stuff on social media, over and over, and then kind of doing, Doug Wilson in Idaho, kind of doing some of that kind of thing and trying to make it happen in that community to a degree. But then I think you see people who would say, I'm a Christian nationalist, and they just mean patriot, or they mean,
right,
kind of, well, America should be a Christian nation. Well, what does that mean, right? And then you've got to start like teasing it out. And they would say, well, of course women should have the right to vote. For them, it just means, their policy positions or just, and that's on the sort of acceptable side of pluralistic democracy. But then for, as we know, there's a darker side of it for some people having to do with race and gender and class and those sorts of things. But I think, the interesting thing when we were talking about identity and what you said, and I think of it too, is the last thing I say, this is borrowing from, I think it's Perry and Whitehead, but that I take a mark of someone being an American Christian nationalist is that their identities as an American and as a Christian are fused, right? Those things are, like we might say, intrinsically related. They're not like, you can't separate, they're inseparable for them. And so I think that's where then a lot of the things we've just talked about with emotions and desires and needs and belonging and significance come in, because of those things, you're trying to find them in both of those things. And I found the same thing in some of the conspiracy stuff in our book on guns. When you start looking at some of the sociological and psychological stuff, it it comes back to, well, this is who I am, who we are, right? And to be able to conceptualize those things differently, it's like, it'd be like telling me being a Christian and I don't know, caring about and thinking we should love each other, like that I should pull those apart. I'm like, no, for me, they're inseparable, right? Now, you don't have to be a Christian to love other people, obviously, but that's like the path I'm taking. So yeah, I think there's something to that. Some of them just are anti-democratic. They're just like, and some of them are like, well, we're going to take care of ourselves. In fact, one of them, they're talking about immigration and about our neighbors, and they're saying, who is my neighbor? And then he starts talking about, I'm not trying to hurt other people. I'm just protecting my family and my neighbors. And he asks that question, who is my neighbor? And then talks about the parable of the
Good Samaritan.
I've lost
Good
it.
Samaritan.
Yeah. I was like, yeah. I'm like, that's the exact question that they like the guy there asked Jesus, and Jesus turns the question on its head. Don't ask that. Ask, how can I be a neighbor? But we're not. Yeah. Right. So I think some people aren't sure what's going on. So that's where I think the kind of stuff that I do can be helpful, because then, oh yeah, no, this is what I believe. And if that's what they believe, I'm not that. Other people, right. It's just like, they might feel alone. I'm like, well, all I ever hear about in my church or in my small group or, whatever it is, or at the office is just, this is Christian Republican or Christian National. I mean, and no, there's a different way. And I mean, yeah, for me, like the way of Jesus is so radically, it doesn't fit. Like there are things that I read in the Bible, I'm like, I don't like that. I don't like that Jesus calls the Pharisees in the Gospels, regardless of sources and that kind of stuff, as, brood of vipers. Like, I don't like that. But, so what do I do with it? Well, I have to figure out what I'm going to do with it. But right. I guess I'm rambling a little bit, but I think the bottom line thing is, again, it's a degree. But I think what worries me, and a friend of mine mentioned this, you have this small group, and this is like Elizabeth expertise, but that smaller group can make use of the resources of the larger group, and then use those resources and that sort, convince people. I mean, I guess what I'm thinking of is the more people at the beginning of the funnel, the more you can get through to the end in the long run. And that's where, if we can get people at the beginning, both with the ideas they talk about, but also with this, just the need for significance and belonging, that's a longer term project. But it appears to me that's the only thing that can actually has a hope of making a significant difference and change.
Yeah. So we're going to take a quick break here from Plank Sip, the sponsor of Campfire Philosophy with J. Aaron Simmons. But when we get back, Elizabeth, I want to then focus. We've been talking about the Christian side and what this means and how that's a kind of ideological overlay. But I also want to talk about this thing that Mike just said about, for a lot of people, nationalism just means loving their country and embracing. I mean, the Olympics are going on, right? Chanting USA at the Olympics doesn't typically mean, xenophobic nationalism. It's just a kind of excited exuberance about one's loyalty to the space and the civics, community in which you find yourself. So I want to think about the nationalist side, which, as you said at the beginning, is one flavor of extremism. But I want to think about what that flavor adds. Is it something distinctive? Is it unique? Or is it really a kind of distraction from something like extremism that is really the concern? It's this willingness to use violence, this willingness to go to ends that are socially destructive. The nationalism's just the terminology. So I want to think about what that is, how that plays out when we get back from this word from Plank Sip.
I hope you are enjoying Campfire Philosophy. I would like to take a moment to thank Plank Sip for sponsoring the show. Daniel Sanderson is the guy behind that media outlet, and he is a fellow lover of philosophy. So if you get a chance, head over to planksip.org. That's PLANKSIP.org. If you sign up for their ideal plan and use the offer code AARON, that's AARON, you will get 50% off for the first 6 months. Free book publishing and lots more. Go check them out. And thanks so much to Daniel and Plank Sip for sponsoring Campfire Philosophy. Now, back to the show.
To everyone, go over to planksip.org, use the code CAMPING or AARON, either one will work, and get 50% off their ideal membership, doing wonderful, wonderful stuff. If you have just joined us, we are talking about Christian nationalism, religious extremism. I've got Mike Austin, philosopher extraordinaire, a brand new book coming out called American Christian Nationalism. And I'm also joined by Elizabeth Neumann, a homeland security expert who has a book that just came out that I highly recommend called Kingdom of Rage. And so we're thinking about these issues tonight. Do remember that this is not live. And so if you've got comments, drop them in there at whatever live stream platform you're watching this on. I will do my best to respond in real time, but we had to record it a couple days early. So just in case you're looking for why your comments are not popping up, that's what it is. So please do drop the comments and the questions. I will try to respond while we are watching this together Monday night. So Elizabeth, what about this nationalist stuff? Again, it seems like nationalism, I mean, I have family members who say, why wouldn't I want to be a nationalist? This, because they hear this just meaning patriotic. And some of them, if they didn't live through the Depression, their parents did. And it's this sense of we've got to come together as a nation, this sense of the greatest generation and American pride, not in anti-foreigner or anti-immigrant sorts of ways, but simply in a sense of like when I go to a Florida State game, I'm absolutely, rallying with the garnet and gold, right? And isn't that a good thing? So what is it about nationalism in particular that is a particular kind of extremist flavor, or maybe even contributes to extremism showing up in particular ways?
Yeah, Aaron, this is a great question. And I mean, patriotism in my mind is different than nationalism. So you can be a patriot, be patriotic about your country, love your country. Nationalism kind of takes it a step farther and actually says we want the government to kind of set the rules for what it means to have a culture, a religion, a civil society. This is what it means to be an American. And it's not just my own interpretation of what it means to be American. I like fireworks on 4th of July. That's what it means to be an American. I like
more apple pie.
More apple pie, right?
It's great at the campfire.
Yeah, it's the government saying thou shalt attend the 4th of July fireworks, right? It's the government actually passing laws to basically institute culture. Now, there are countries that are nationalistic and are not at all anywhere close to the line of extremism. You can even look at the country from which the United States came from, the United Kingdom. They have stronger elements of nationalism than we do, in part because we were pushing them off and we wanted to do our own religion our own way. But there is the Church of England, and the King of England is the head of the Church of England. That is a nationalistic aspect that historically, if you didn't belong to the Church of England, you didn't have all the rights and privileges of a citizen. And there were consequences, sometimes just societal consequences, but sometimes you go back for 500 years, people would get beheaded if you were Catholic instead of Church of England, right? So there's long history of government instituting culture, and when that becomes a mandate that reduces your rights and privileges as a citizen or possibly leads to persecution, that's not good. That's the part of nationalism that's not great. And it leads to kind of an embracing of extremism, right? If you don't belong to what we've already defined is what makes us this nation, and you're not only a them, but somehow I perceive you they as a threat to my success or survival. Okay, so in order for me to maintain my purity, my nationalistic desires, I've got to persecute you or harm you. So the three main components that I think of, and this is I'm borrowing this from Paul Miller's book, The Religion of American Greatness. He's a professor out of Georgetown and also a fellow believer. But like the three main components I'm looking at are the ethnic component, the cultural component, and the government component, and the religious component. And anytime the government is taking those three components and starting to bake them into the law, that or in the case of where we are now, you have a group of people who are saying, what I want is for the government to bake this into the law, to give favor to Christians over non-Christians, to pass laws that would be contradictory to pluralism or contradictory to perhaps some of our constitutional amendments, in order to somehow make that more Christian, more aligned with biblical morality. That is becoming, that to me is what nationalism is. And the place where I get nervous from an extremist standpoint is when you do have, and Mike cited some of the authors, he didn't say them by name, but I've read some of those books too. When you have people starting to say things like, yeah, you might need to stock up on your weapons to and make sure you're practiced in case. That's what militia do. That's, we've been through this before. It might be a different ideology and a different wrapping, but anytime people start weaving a story about how the rest of them, they're out to get us, we better protect ourselves, that doesn't end well usually. Also, they tend to kind of, well, this is true of all of our politics, but it's a hyperbolizing and a catastrophizing of reality.
Yeah.
So they'll pick one story, usually out of California or, some other very liberal state, and be like, this is coming for all of us. And you're like, really?
Right.
I mean, I don't think that's coming to Texas anytime soon. That's where I grew up. Yes, the Californians are migrating to Texas, and the Texans don't like that the Californians are coming to Texas. But why are they coming to Texas? Because they're done with California being as liberal as they are. So there's this tendency to cherry pick a couple of examples of government overreach or, morality. And I'm not suggesting that citizens, Christians, shouldn't stand up and say, like, I am concerned about that. That policy is not good for the family, or that policy is not the best way to embrace or to appreciate human dignity, right? Like, we should be clear about the values that the Bible lays out and advocate for those values, for protecting the family, for human dignity. But we should also not be people that are driven by fear. And all of the extremist ideology, Christian nationalism, it sells based on fear. It sells based on this, like, sky is falling, the world is out to get us. And you're like, yeah, Jesus told us that already. I mean, he already told us that if they hated him, like, how much more will they hate us, right? Like, so this is not new. We have a model in Jesus and in the disciples of the early church who endured way more persecution than we did. They showed us how to walk this out. It's not by running off and joining a monastery. I'm not saying there hasn't been a time and place where that was needed in Christian history, but I don't think that's where we are. And it's also not, let's take up the sword and fight. Like, Jesus is really clear about that. Like, that is not the way to his kingdom. And so I do worry that we have way too much fear saturated in our communities. And anytime you have a people that are just trafficking in that fear, like whether it's in their news or their social media or the books they're reading or the Christian pastors that they might be listening to, just constantly beating up on, here are all the ways that the liberals are coming to get you and your children. It creates that opening, right? Like the uncertainty and the fear create that cognitive opening for somebody to come in and tell, and this is what extremists do. I have a solution for you. And it tends to be very black and white. And it tends to be like, you just come down this path with me. All of your problems will be solved. And so it's not that the individual in take the fear, take the uncertainty away would normally be open to that ideology. But when you throw everything that we've thrown at, between COVID, rapid change in our society, like the economy is very different than it was 10 years ago. We could sit here and do an entire, a podcast just on how drastically the world has changed in a 10 and 20 year period. Human beings don't like change, and that creates vulnerability, and it creates opportunity for slick people to come in and offer this Christian nationalist view of the world. It sounds really simple and safe. And like, yeah, that it's kind of close to what I read in the Bible once somewhere. And if you aren't rooted in Christ, if you don't have an anchor for what we do in times of uncertainty and fear, then that seems like a plausible, good solution. So that's the concern I have, is not, I mean, there's a separate concern we could spend time on, which is like, it's not good for your soul. It's idolatry. It's political idolatry, right? Like, so there's a concern for the church. There's a concern for the country from a constitutional standpoint. Like, it's not good that we have so many people that are like open to this idea that we, this pluralistic thing is, freedom of religion thing. Yeah, let's get rid of that. Let's just make it all about the Christians. Like, that's not great that we have so many people open to that. And then the biggest concern from a security standpoint is that it's also an ideology that historically is associated with some small segment who then take it to this conclusion that violence is the way to address your needs.
Yeah, this is super helpful. I mean, the idea that nationalism is distinct from patriotism, not due to affinity or celebration of a particular kind of community, but is wedded to a very particular vision of legislated cultural norms that then dictate what identity participation looks like. That I find extremely helpful. I think your account of what nationalism is as a cultural move is really helpful for then trying to maybe, get our fingers lock into why authoritarian laced right-wing populism then becomes the particular mode by which this kind of religiously framed nationalistic enterprise starts to take hold, right? So one of the things I found interesting, and I know, Elizabeth, you've signed some of these papers, and documents very publicly, but I found really interesting in the anti-Trump Republican sort of movement has been, this isn't conservative. Conservative is a particular vision about the ratio of liberty and equality that gets cashed out relative to what Nozick will call a minimal state. Like, conservatism is a complicated and maybe even true vision of social priorities. I'm not a conservative. So what that means to me is I disagree about that ratio. And I think that it's not the best vision for social life, right? But notice that disagreement is one that people of goodwill, people of common cause, people of committed moral fiber can really disagree in responsible ways, right? Reason giving requires that kind of disagreement be active in our society. In fact, I had Scott Aiken and Kim Maslin on a few weeks ago talking about why disagreement is required for democratic politics. And it was this very point, because if I assume that P and everybody else assumes that P, we now don't have any way to check our views because we don't have reasons given to cause us to rethink them. I need people who think not P to be good at it, right? But what populism does, I'm getting to a question, I promise, Mike. I won't just raise my voice at the end and make it sound like a question like my students do, like declarative sentences that upspeak, right? Populism is so seductive because it's not conservatism in the sense of a different vision of that, again, ratio of equality to liberty about social governance. It's a vision of how we make culturally normative something that one person can embody, right? It ends up being a suspicion of the people calling for nuance. It ends up being a challenge to those saying disagreement is deliberatively important. Wrong. If you disagree, you've got to be shut down. This populist movement led by the strongman figure who then will speak for us, like, it ends up eliminating everything that deliberation would prize. And in your own work, Mike, populism would then be rejecting humility as a virtue and rejecting hospitality as a deliberative norm, right? We want neither hospitality nor humility to be part of our cultural set of expectations, because as nationalists in this populist form, we have the strong man who is legislating for us the vision of what now will dictate all of our allegiance. Hence, loyalty, as we all see right now, becomes a more important social value than reason giving and critical engagement, right? So if populism is also the kind of, I would suggest it's the third leg of this weird, dangerous tripod. You've got a religious set of commitments that overlays things with theological norms. You've got a nationalistic leg, which then says, and now we've got to legislate those cultural realities as expected for all. And then we've got a populist leg that says, this is most likely to get done with an authoritarian approach to cultural engagement, right? If that's right, what does it look like, Mike? I mean, you do these Wisdom Wednesdays posts on your amazing Substack, and you call for us to think about the virtue traditions and all this. Like, what does it mean to call for virtue as an epistemic exercise, right? Having to do with the way we think together. How do we do that, given that populism, nationalism, and this kind of religious extremism actively are opposed to that kind of virtuous discourse? Like, what you're doing is not just opposed to it. You're now anti-American, anti-Christian, and anti-democrat. Like, you become the very thing that they oppose, because you're saying, y'all, what would it look like to say maybe we're wrong? No, that's showing the emperor has no clothes. We cannot allow it. So how have you introduced virtue as actually even possible, given that tripod of disaster?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some similarities where I'm not. There are people that are just at the moment beyond persuading to even consider that stuff, and so this is. I've realized it off and on, but it sort of crystallized in the past couple of weeks in some conversations that there are certain things I'm just especially even with people I know, but online I can't change them. I mean, that seems obvious, but I think there's a part of me this, of course, I'm an moral philosopher, so I'm like very idealistic in certain ways. So I'm cool. If we just like make good argument. I mean, this kind of goes back to what Elizabeth talked about, the counter ideology. And I believe that's important because ideas matter, they drive things, but they're not all. I mean, a lot of other stuff matters in many ways more in some people's lives. But it's hard to know what to do, Aaron. I think we've had this conversation before in other contexts, but I'm kind of at the point with some people where I'm just like, if we can't agree on the fundamental basic ground rules of dialogue, just basic respect, then I don't know what I can. I mean, if you want to sit down and talk, I'll do it. But I mean, but if your first response back is you hate America, or you don't want people to be called Marxist rats because you're a Marxist sympathizer, and I'm just like, I don't even know, what are we doing? I'm just, I want to find, but there are people out there that the ideas will help them, maybe help them even, not enter the funnel, or help them to feel more secure that no, there is there's a sound there is a good theological argument for other positions, right? And I think what happens with a lot of this stuff, and it goes back to the identity, and Caleb Campbell, where I actually met Elizabeth at a conference he had in Phoenix back in the winter for pastors in Phoenix. But this is what's going on when you're 55. You think it just disappeared. Whatever I was about to say. So
Caleb Campbell.
Caleb Campbell.
He has a book coming out, Disarming Leviathan.
That's right. Seeing nationalists as your mission. Yeah. Seeing nationalists as like a mission field. So it's more, his is more like, it's kind of like a conspiracy theory book, only, by one guy instead of a bunch of academics. But
interesting.
To help people deal with people, help love people. But man, it's just I don't know where to go when that's the response is you're a Marxist or you hate America or was having a conversation with somebody about critical race theory back, when that was a big deal. And
A hot
the
second.
that this person told me that they said, well, CRT is a demon. I'm like, I don't even know what that means.
Oh.
I mean, actually, when I think about it, I don't. I mean, I know what you're saying is
I know
horrible.
what I think you mean, but yeah.
But
Wow.
so yeah, I think it's hard to do.
Well, and it's weird. You and I recently on Facebook were commiserating some of the things we had been called by others. And
I want to hear some of these.
The one that Mike was being sort of even charitable to his critics and saying things like, "I'm apparently a Marxist sympathizer. Turns out I think Marx is wrong about blah blah." And I shared some. I was recently told, I might get the specific wording wrong, but it was to the effect that I was in league with the minions of Satan because, not because of my affirming stance on LGBTQ, which I am fully affirming. It was because on a religious Facebook group, the debate was one where I simply entered and said, "Hey, everybody, maybe we should be a little bit more careful not to think that the Bible is as clear as you all make it sound." And yeah, I was told I was in league with Satan. Now, we still disagreed. We still had different views on where we came down. But it was that moment of humanizing the other. And for me, Mike, every one of those 100+ comments, I responded to each one of them because I kept thinking in my naive Habermasianism, well, if I just keep modeling good reason giving, surely they will see the virtue of epistemic discourse. Nope. That was not humanizing. Reason giving didn't humanize. The experience of seeing another in need did. And so one of the questions that then I wrestle with a lot, and this is coming from friends of mine like Robert Talese and Scott Aiken who have written on this, where they say, one of the things that we've got to stop thinking is that there is a policy fix to human relationships.
Yes.
And maybe what we need to do, and this is kind of Rob's vision, maybe we should start doing city bowling leagues again as a intentional way to save democracy. Maybe we need church softball leagues again, because then, I grew up Pentecostal, the Baptists aren't the enemy. They're just the people who get God wrong, but man, they can hit home runs. It changes how we start relating to each other in ways that the philosopher Richard Rorty says in response to a guy named Norman Garris, who has this great book about World War II activism. Garris says what motivates real transformation and, Germans, saving Jews and hiding them during World War II was they saw their humanity. Rorty comes along, and I think both of these people are right, by the way, but Rorty comes along and says, there's no thing called humanity. They saw the neighbor whose kid plays soccer with their kid. And you're like, well, I don't want that person to die. Sure, hide in my basement. I think it's probably both, right? We need philosophers to give us categories like humility and virtue and hospitality and rethinking what these ideas mean. But we also probably need to realize, man, the conservatives with whom I disagree, and maybe even the Christian nationalists, make really, really good fried chicken. And I probably eat at their restaurants more than I am willing to admit, right? Finding a way to interact as bodies sharing value, where those values may not be theories of the good, but those values might be the love of Friday night football at high schools. It might be the enjoyment of throwing snowballs in winter. What would you say, Elizabeth? And again, I know this is asking a policy wonk strategist to say, hey, let's go play softball. But
no, I actually write that in the book. It's one of the solutions. Proximity is a protective factor for those who, we talk about being at risk or being vulnerable to extremism, and what you can have in your life that built a protective factor to resist when we all will be exposed to extremism, because it's so in the mainstream at this point. It used to be.
You call that proximity? That's the term.
So proximity is one of those one of those protective factors. And it can be proximity to people that have different views than you. It can be proximity to people from different ethnic backgrounds. We know, for example, when you take a person that is really concerned about immigration, and they read the political rhetoric, both sides, by the way, just not doing anybody any services by just their top line talking points. Like, it's a complex issue. But what we find is that when you take an individual and you put them in a Bible study with an immigrant, and they just start to do Bible study together, and then they, in the course of doing Bible study, learn their story, it changes their view on immigration, because it's no longer those people who are trying to come to my country. It's my friend Christy or Maria, the refugee that came from Syria, or the migrant from Venezuela. It becomes much more real because it's a real person. So it's about humanizing people who are different than us, not because it's going to change our views, but because it removes the us them. And I got this from Jonathan Haidt's work, but there is in Generation Z and younger, which is influencing millennials and older. But I think the further away you are from Gen Z, the more easily we go like, wait, no, that's not what we taught you. Like, how did you come to this conclusion? In the Gen Z space, to acknowledge somebody, say, I understand your argument. To them, that is platforming their argument. That is affirming their argument. And so they've been taught, and this actually does get a little bit into critical race theory, but more like critical theory broadly. They've been taught that in order to right the wrongs of the past and to elevate marginalized voices, it's important to shun or to push back anybody that can't see what you can see, because you're Gen Z and you've been taught to see it, right? And so there's this immediate, almost guttural reaction of, no, I can't even listen to your argument because you're clearly evil. And you're just, I'm like, wait, it's like just a policy opinion about, I don't know, race reparations, or, whether or not, you pick your thing. For them, it's a moral thing.
A moral issue.
It's a moral issue.
It was fascinating. I taught a class last year. It was a dialogue course. And this one student had said something that I thought was really problematic, right? Not immoral, but just was just misunderstanding. It was a class about a class, ironically. So we were talking about economic realities and identity and stuff. And I just thought it misunderstood something essential about economic policy or economic theory. And so I was pushing back and saying, well, look, I think I disagree about blah, blah. And the student says, you're not even listening to me. You're not even hearing me. And I stopped and I said, no, I absolutely hear you. I just think you're wrong. And it was like the worst thing I could have possibly said. It fell so flat. And here I was trying to say, don't you understand, other human that is equal to me? Our disagreement requires deep understanding. I have to take you seriously enough to think you might be wrong, to see you as another human. If I see you as, a patronized human adjacent being, then we end up in the eternal feminine stuff you get in romanticism, where women are so pure they could never do anything wrong. And you're like, no, that's absolutely morally patronizing, because it strips away full agency. So allowing someone really to be wrong, but in ways that elevate their humanity, is something that I, for what it's worth, I don't want to sound like the old guy fussing about the youngsters, but I do think that's something I struggle with my students more and more and more, because like you're saying, it's, if you don't shut down even the question mark, then you are with the opponent.
Yeah. It's so different from what we were raised with. And I think that's when I read Haidt's book, and Yasha Monk's done some work on this, and you guys are actually in the classroom. I just work with Gen Z, and I still have to be like, but I just want to fix you because this is just not reality. I'm like, okay, that's not helpful. But I do tell my kids, I use my kids, I'm like, do not buy into this because this is just not reality. Like, just because somebody disagrees with you doesn't make them evil.
Yeah, doesn't make them wrong.
And Jonathan Haidt talks about like one of the key features that he thinks is contributing to a whole host of challenges for Gen Z is that us them context is baked in. So in a way that is not about like the football team you're arguing or you're rooting for, but it's like if you're not fully 100% exactly like me and all of my beliefs, then you are evil. As opposed to the Alexander Solzhenitsyn approach of like the line of good and evil runs through all of us, right? Like, and that's actually really dangerous from a security perspective. If you think you're pure and that you could never do anything wrong, then that's where you end up with, in my view, some of the Christian nationalist stuff. It's like the end justifies the means. Like, hey, our end here is something pure and good. Look the other way on the means, but the end is all that really matters. And we are increasingly, it's all, I mean, you guys are the philosophers. You could probably frame this better than I can. But it just feels like the whole entire set of principles of classical liberalism are just going to be like, maybe we're going to toss these out. And I'm like, well, I don't even know where to start then. If we're just like everything I know and the whole way that the world has run is based on these principles. And it kind of feels like what populism is and what, you know, when you have a generation that's like, no, I'm pure good and they're all evil because you disagree with me on one policy issue. Like, I don't actually know how to engage in that in a winsome way because I actually can't understand it.
Well, and for what it's worth, this will get me in lots of trouble and we will lose all the goodwill of everybody who joined the Swifties from your earlier comment. One of this would take so much more to work out. I'll drop this. And then Mike, I have a question for you. And then we're going to turn to some camping questions. So one of the things that I think populism of the left in America looks like right now is something like the current Swifties movement.
Oh, interesting. Tell me more.
What I mean, this is one of those things like, man, you can't put this in print because it will destroy everything. And I should say, I highly, highly respect Taylor Swift's writing ability. I think she's a brilliant musician. I'm not a fan of her music, which is a very important distinction as a musician myself. But the fact that, so think about it. We defined earlier, right-wing populism is this idea where you have a quasi-authoritarian matrix whereby one person speaks for the us so that we no longer have to be critically invested in what our voice will look like. Well, what does that look like on the left? And I actually don't think it's, you know, the woke mob sort of discourse. I think all of that stuff is a boogeyman that doesn't really exist and nobody really understands even what people are talking about when they're really worried about it. I do think it looks like cultural movements where unquestioned loyalty is deployed in ways that cannot tolerate anything like legitimate questions about the rightness of a perspective. So notice Taylor Swift, to her credit, fairly silent on lots of public issues. And I think this is very much, she's got good handlers and she's also smart and wise as a woman of dignity. Like she is good at only speaking up in very careful ways, right? But notice whatever she says, if you're a Swiftie fan, like I don't think there's a lot of fans saying, well, I don't know about that, Taylor. Right? It becomes immediately accepted at the level of because she can do no wrong.
Right.
And that's that purity doctrine functioning now, again, in a much, much less insidious authoritarian way, notice. But the sheer power that someone like Taylor Swift has, not as musician, notice, but as cultural influencer. This is something that I think is a kind of tell me, please, what I am to think about this thing so that I don't have to do the hard work of realizing these things are complicated. I think there's an awful lot of that on the left that gets discharged onto cultural figures, not onto public political figures. And this is part of why I think that you just don't see on the left the kind of like, even people getting excited about Kamala or whatever. It's not the loyalty moves like you see with Trump, right? Excitement, sure, but yet the politics.
I'm going to take one little. I think that I agreed with you 6 months ago. I have watched, particularly after the Biden debate where he did so poorly, and there was,
which I openly called for him to step down when that happened. I was one of those people. Yep.
And I watched a number of people openly call and get lambasted for being disloyal. And it was so fascinating because you're like, oh, okay. So
which is horrifying.
We're both going to do it. We're both going to be like blind loyalty. Right. I'm not going to actually tell you what I saw. We're just going to ignore it.
But it didn't work.
Right? It didn't work. It didn't work.
And that's all I'm suggesting.
Yeah. I agree with that. But I do think it exposed, Mehdi Hassan actually called it blue MAGA, that there was like a blue MAGA aspect too. And that makes sense because our politics has become so cult-like and it's so identity-based and people aren't bowling anymore. They're not doing local things and their entire...
But they are going to Taylor Swift concerts.
They're going to Taylor Swift concerts. There you go.
Willing to spend half of their retirement fund or their college fund to do it, right? Which I'm not knocking. I'm just saying notice...
I got tempted. I decided
oh my gosh, like
it's insane.
It's a lot. And even like, so Beyonce'd be the other one. And for what it's worth, I so highly respect both of them. I use Beyonce's Homecoming in my classes as one of the greatest models of what critically thinking about gender and race looks like in public ways. I think it's brilliant. But I have all kinds of problems with the idea that someone would lose control of their body and their ability to stand in the presence of such greatness. Because that's the thing, I think, again, on the left, it's a culture influencer sort of trembling, where on the right, it's a authoritarian politics of he's the guy who will save us. I don't think anybody thinks Beyonce is going to save them. I just think that they might look at Beyonce or Taylor Swift as a kind of religious figure, right? And being able to parse some of what it means to get back to the place where we took, Mike, this is going to be my question to you, is like, how do we restore any sense of respect for expertise? You've got Elizabeth, the expert in Homeland Security, Mike, an expert in philosophy. That just basically means no one's listening to either of you. Right. But if you've got a really successful podcast, if you've done some amazing, top tier work on some Instagram feed, like now you might make a difference. It seems to me that the cultural worry I have is not that people like Taylor Swift and I think they should listen to, Lamb of God, which I do. It's more, what does it look like when we have erased a commitment to expertise, not being a, pardon the use of the term, but a trump card for shutting down discourse, but as an invitation to elevate the level of our discourse. I want to talk to experts so I can be made better, right? That sense seems gone in our public discourse. But at the very same time, we have the rise, as you say, Elizabeth, of the discursive habits of Gen Z that seem to be obstinately resistant to elevated discourse, where elevated discourse looks like middle-aged white mansplaining to them. And if that's what it is, they should be obstinately opposed to it. But if it's be reflective enough to think that maybe you don't have stuff all figured out and this is powerful, well, the ringleaders of that sort of move, I think, are cultural influencers. I don't think they're political figures on the left.
Interesting.
So, Mike, how do we not defer to experts, which I think is actually a good idea in lots of cases? I went to the ER this week. I had a very bad mountain bike crash. And I'm really glad when the ER doc says, your hand's not broken. use a lot of ice. I didn't say, dude, I'm going to do my own research. Like, I was like, cool,
Let me
done.
check my influencers.
Yep. I was like, let me see who on Instagram. Like, nope, you're good. Finish. Like, so I think we should defer sometimes, but in most cases, I want to care about expertise because it makes our discourse better. It makes it more nuanced. It makes it more aware of things we are otherwise likely to forget. How is it that we restore that in a world where we've got, sadly, one side seemingly, no matter what Trump does or says or how idiotic the statement might be, running to defend it as brilliant and the rest of us are just too stupid to understand? Or whatever the, again, culture or influencer is claiming, we're just out of step and we're old heads who don't get it, right? Like both of those seem to be anti-intellectual is my point. And I'm not suggesting Taylor Swift is anti-intellectual, right? But that movement, I think, is how do we maybe not fight, it's wrong. How do we encourage the virtuous epistemic health by which we are better when we are able to hear from those who are good? What does that look like, Mike? And then we're going to turn to camping.
Yeah, so I think I got this mostly or partially from Dallas Willard, but I'll just say what I do in my classes. Like tomorrow morning's first day of class here. So I've got students taking beginning ethics or intro to ethics, and then honors class where we read a bunch of different things, Plato's Republic. But I say, I talk about the class and say, look, we're going to talk about things that people don't really want to talk about because they get so angry about it and it's controversial and we're not good at that. And I said, but I want us to look at both how I want to look at you and me and each other is we're not like opposing. So when we're disagreeing about something and actually this works, and maybe it's just because I'm in Kentucky and I've been told everything that happens here that happens every place else, but just 20 minutes late or 20 years late. So
y'all are catching up. Yeah, for only 20 hours now.
But like so I said, we're not really going to debate in this class. We're not going to like be opposed face to face, trying to battle it out. Let's like look at each other, both me and you, each other, the people we're reading, like standing shoulder to shoulder, looking out, trying to figure it out together, like what's true. So Aristotle is going to be a voice, but he's not going to be, we don't just do what he says. I'm going to be a voice, but I tell them often I'm not going to tell you what I think. And it's more just because I don't want 18-year-olds trying to just say what they think I want to hear so they get an A, but I really think if it's so much, and this has helped me in online interactions and others in the past 4 or 5 years where I've learned some lessons, just like this is what goes back to the human thing is just ask a question. Someone can be kind of aggressive and attacking. And if I just ask and I get to a place where it's honest, I just ask them a question. Well, why do you think that? Or what about, why? I'm not like, and that's all, but the genuine curiosity comes out. So I think modeling it, I think just seeing experts as another important voice, but not the only one, right? And it's kind of harder in our field. It's philosophy, right? So it's all relative, and what students often think. And there are difficult questions. That's why we're still like doing this stuff. All the other, it's kind of like Aristotle did biology, but that kind of became its own science. So now we just do, we're just arguing about this. So I think that's a big part is modeling it, and it's just it's a non-antagonistic, it's a compassion. I'm trying to encourage and model compassionate curiosity, maybe is the best way to put it.
That's a great way to put it.
And that experts they have an important voice, but they're not the only voice. And we can disagree with them, but we need to have good. I just can't help myself. We need to have some good reasons.
Have good reasons. I love that compassionate curiosity. Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting, Elizabeth. Last week, one of my guests is a Republican city council or a county council member from my local area, who's a very good friend of mine. And it was fascinating because she's brilliant. And we had a wonderful conversation about, it was called A Philosopher, a Pastor, and a Politician Go Into a Bar. And so I had an Anglican priest, this, politician, and then myself, and we talked about religion and politics. And it was fascinating because after we got done, I had somebody who had watched the episode and reached out and says, I just Googled this person and she's a Republican. I was like, well, yeah, and it absolutely blew their mind because she was reasonable and smart and reflective. And I kept, at the end, I was like, wow, isn't that fascinating? That I don't know if they were assuming, well, because I'm fairly progressive and kind of open about this, that I wouldn't sit and talk to a Republican, or that this Republican was reasonable and they just don't know any who are that way. So part of Mike, in this idea of modeling compassionate curiosity, I think part of how we model that is also having friends and colleagues with whom we disagree in public and responsibly, right? Like doing disagreement not as theater, but as truth seeking is something that I think is really, really important. And this is why I tell my students, Elizabeth, you might take issue with this, I don't know, but I tell my students where I stand on a lot of stuff, never because I want them to agree with me, but because I expect that then, as a theist, when I'm defending reasons for atheism, they get, oh, wait a minute, you mean you can actually take seriously views that you reject, right? But if they don't know where I stand, it all becomes the theater of something like objectivist, discursive play. And so I say to them, y'all, I am not conservative. I was raised conservative, but I no longer am conservative. If you are conservative, I need you to be good at it because I may have missed something. And the only way that I'll likely change my view is if you can help me see, with good reasons, Mike, where I've gone astray. But the problem is we find ourselves, and I try to be equal opportunity in this, if you think, no, well, we're going to come out of the gate, a Trumpist. Well, the worry is the loyalty commitments are probably going to make us obstinately opposed to what philosophy expects of us. Alternatively, if you take being woke to mean you've already got all of the good and justice and identity figured out, well, you probably are obstinately opposed to everything philosophy expects of us, right? So this isn't about where you land. It's about to what are you exposed, to what are you open, right? And this is where I love your last thing we'll say, and we'll end with some fun. I love your idea of proximity, because there's a Jewish philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas who says that ultimately proximity is the name for the moral dignity of the other that cannot be ignored, right? It calls to us such that our selfhood is a response to that call. I can't say, oh, they are distant from me. The proximity is so pervasive that my very self, he says, is a response. Here I am, which he's taking from, the Torah and the book of Genesis, right? Where he says, where are you, Adam? Hinei, here I am. The here I am, the first instant of selfhood, is a response to the call of the face of the other person. Proximity defines us as a moral identity. Yeah. And if that's right, my goodness, we have screwed up our social functioning, because we think the point is, how do we secure enough votes to get through our policy view in order to maintain power? And we miss the idea that if securing votes causes us to say, I only care about 50% plus one, I've ignored the proximity of the face of all of those 49.9% of the other, right? And this is where, Mike, I'm with you. Sometimes there just aren't conversations that can be had because, you know what? Maybe I'm in league with Satan. I don't know where we go from this. So I'm going to wish you well and to all a good night. But it also seems to me that if we find ways to bowl together and to get ice cream and to take walks and to listen to Taylor Swift, maybe that's actually the way we get out of this mess. Is we realize, look, shake it off is not something that is only true for Republicans or Democrats. We all have to shake off frustrating days. And maybe, as Deep Blue Something says, we both kind of liked breakfast at Tiffany's. And well, maybe that's enough. Maybe we just need a really, really thin sense of interhuman connection to do the hard work of intersocial living. Yeah. And that's at least my hope. And I'm such a fan of the fact that, Mike, you are writing to these spaces, and Elizabeth, my goodness, like I'm in awe of the fact that you sit in the halls of power and say smart things to people who often maybe don't want to hear smart things. Thank you both for what you are doing and the ways in which you do it. I'm absolutely hopeful because of the work that the two of you are doing.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, it's an honor to be with you. All right, we're going to close out tonight by moving from the lighthearted stuff to the real serious intellectual work. I ask every guest I have on Campfire Philosophy with Aaron Simmons 5 questions. And by the way, Elizabeth, I always have to say my stupid name when I do the title, because there's a Campfire Philosophy in like New Zealand that reached out to me and said, hey, we've already got this name. So the technical title, I always try to differentiate. My friends Hamish and Michael, we've now met each other and we're trying to collaborate a little bit. They have Campfire Philosophy, so mine is with J. Aaron Simmons. It's not the George Costanza, just announce yourself in the third person and everybody will think you're important. None of that's happening. All right. So first question, Elizabeth, we'll start with you. Beach or mountains? Which one?
We moved to Denver to be near the mountains. So I guess when we go on vacation, we often go to the beach.
Gotcha.
Which I love the beach. I love both.
Yeah.
I mean, if you can have mountains and beach, that's like perfect. But when we had choice of where to move, we moved to the mountains because that's my soul's love language.
Your virtue right shining through. I get that. I mean, I guess you could have done like the Oregon coast or something.
It's a little dark up there.
It's a lot of rain.
I lived in Seattle for 2 years. It's just like dark half the year. And I grew up in Texas. I need more sun. Denver is like perfect. You get lots of sun and you got the mountains. So. It's awesome.
Yeah. Well, Mike, beach or mountains?
Yeah, mountains, 100%. Grew up going to them. Got my PhD in Boulder, so we were right there. We were actually in Fairplay, Colorado this summer. It's just something incredible about. Yeah.
See, I knew I liked you for some good reasons.
That's right.
Number 2. So, Mike, we'll start with you this time. You're sitting by the campfire in the mountains. In your case, do you drink hot chocolate, hot coffee, or hot tea?
Well, probably would be something else, but if those are my 3 choices, I would go hot chocolate.
I've had a surprising number of wine as the subtle fourth, just so you know. I
was thinking like in the bourbon family somewhere, but no, I would not coffee or tea because like the coffee would keep me awake, and tea I've tried to like and I just can't. And so and I do have kind of a sweet tooth, so I'll go with the hot chocolate.
Hot chocolate. I like that. That'll work. So Elizabeth, hot chocolate, hot coffee, or tea, or is there a fourth that we need to bring in?
Yeah, clarification. Is this the campfire in the morning or the campfire at night? Because if it's in the morning, I have to have coffee.
Oh, well, that's
such a good question. Such a good notice, Mike. Here we are just assuming.
I just assumed it was night. That's right.
Yeah, you got to have a campfire in the morning too.
Make breakfast. That's
always cold.
Oh yeah. So coffee in the morning, but are you worried about
no? And it's got to be good coffee. Like if I'm going camping. Like you can skimp on a lot of things, but you got to have really good coffee.
Okay.
Otherwise, I'm not going.
What are you drinking at night?
Probably
you're over there
wine.
You're with Mike hitting the bourbon. I got you. The wine. I had somebody.
Hike a long day.
I had somebody say, which I thought was a clever answer. They would drink the hot chocolate, but then with about half of it left, they would pour in coffee, so they had a mocha. And I thought, well, now that's a clever resisting of the binary, right? A real Derridian answer, huh, Mike? All right. Number 3. So this can be either evening or midday or morning. So again, pick your time of day campfire. But you're drinking whatever you find appropriate. What is your favorite campfire food other than s'mores, Elizabeth?
Oh, I was going to say s'mores.
But see, everyone knows that's the only real answer. So we're digging deep here on campfire philosophy.
All right. Okay. This is going to sound weird, but probably the best best meal I've ever had on a mountain.
Okay.
I'm on Kilimanjaro, and it's the day before we summit,
Oh
and
my
I haven't
gosh.
been feeling well. And somebody had this, oh gosh, it's like the meal ready to eat, like, and it was like
Yeah.
chicken noodle soup, and it's just
Yep.
hot water, and it was the most delicious food I had had in 7 days. And
Wow.
so I will say, like, it's very contextual. It's like, what's your context? Is it cold outside? Is it warm outside? You know, did you go for a long hike? And this was like day 7 of a, you
Wow.
know, 8-day hike. So
Yeah.
like we are beaten up. It's high altitude. I'm like, I don't think I'm gonna make it. And this was like
That did
the
it.
most amazing meal.
The high
Freeze
sodium,
dried, yeah, hot,
ready to
very high
go.
sodium.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was so good.
That's an awesome answer. Wow. Kilimanjaro, my goodness. All right. So anything you say, Mike, is going to be like, well, down here in the low country of Kentucky,
Yeah.
like, but unless you've summited like Rainier or Everest or something. But what are you eating at the campfire?
Yeah, I mean, I love the breakfast. Like, just it doesn't have to just the normal, like, eggs, bacon, pan, whatever. Just
So
the
good.
good,
So
like,
yep.
yeah,
Cast iron skillet. Yep.
that's right. Yeah, it just tastes better. And there's some I can't remember. I think my dad used to make something where you'd put like what are those things called? The pot.
Oh, the Dutch ovens.
Dutch oven, that's it. Yeah, it's like
Yeah,
something in there,
coals on
like
top.
egg and sausage, potatoes and cheese, all kind of in
So
there
good.
together. And yeah,
Oh my
something
gosh.
about that outdoor when it's like you still see your breath in the morning. You're having good coffee. I'm with you on that. And then those things, that's good stuff.
Oh, love it, love it. I think for me, my dad actually this week got me a new book called Fire Pit Recipes. I don't know if it'll
Nice.
show
There
up.
you go.
And so I was looking through it before our episode tonight, and they say a recipe that I had never even thought about doing, but it makes so much sense. So you get your cast iron skillet, layer it with just plain tortilla chips, and then you actually build nachos on top of it. So you sprinkle cheese and, maybe a little bit of jalapeno or whatever, maybe some refried beans. And then that goes over the fire. And so then your cheese actually gets kind of like, crispy against the skillet. And so I was thinking, wow, that is definitely a must try. Some cast iron skillet nachos, I think, is a thing that is in my future. All right. Number 4. So you both have mentioned music, which I find very compelling about each of you. I actually, on my Substack, Elizabeth, it's called Philosophy in the Wild.
Nice.
I do a weekly thing for all my paid subscribers every Monday called Music Mondays.
Ooh.
And so we think philosophically about music or different genres or tracks or lyrics or even rhythms or whatever. So I love that you're mentioned Taylor Swift, and Mike, of course, you're a U2 silly fan, which I find compelling, even though I don't really share that affinity. So you're sitting at the campfire, eating your good food, drinking your coffee or hot chocolate or wine or whatever. What song do you play if you pick up the guitar, or if you don't play, you request from the guitarist to your right? What's the song you want played there by the campfire, eating this good food and drinking this great drink, having this great conversation? Let's start with you, Elizabeth.
No, I went last time.
All right, Mike.
It's Mike's
I'll
turn.
come back to you.
Yeah.
What do you want, Mike? What song?
Oh, man.
And I can think of like 19 U2 songs that might work.
Yeah.
We're going to see what deep cut you draw from here.
Yeah. Gosh. Well, the one I was going to say this B-side. It's called Waves of Sorrow, but that's kind of depressing, so I wouldn't do that. I mean, 40 is seems like a classic campfire song, because it's you could do it with an acoustic guitar, and it's the kind of like, life is like kind of sucks, but God's there even anyway, and I'm still good, I mean, and so it's sort of like, it's my own sort of like split. There's hope in the midst of apparent hopelessness.
All right. I think it's a great song. You're definitely getting a little deeper than Kumbaya, so I appreciate that.
That's right.
All right, Elizabeth, we gave you the extra time.
I know.
And
Yeah,
you gotta
thank
swim
you.
hard.
All right,
come correct.
So to be clear, I know anything I know about Taylor Swift is because of my daughter, who is quite a Swiftie.
Okay.
I would say I'm more like Mike. U2 is my favorite band. I like,
Oh,
you know,
wow.
Coldplay
Okay.
and, you know,
Okay.
giving you a little flavor. But
Oh,
I also like some bluegrass. So like if you're at the
nice.
campfire and you got the acoustic guitar, you can play a little bluegrass. But I'm
Yep.
terrible at like remembering song names. If you were to play them, I'd be like, oh yeah, I like that one. But I'm
That one.
terrible at
Okay.
like song
That's
names.
okay. I think bluegrass is a great option. And in fact, I was trying to think, well, what would I pick tonight? I always pick different stuff every week. I actually think some acoustic covers of Taylor Swift songs would be really cool for what it's worth. Again, having not thrown shade to anyone listening, there was no shade thrown to Taylor, only to the cultural logic of being a Swiftie. That's all I've critiqued. But no, I actually, bluegrass, I think that it would be really cool to throw out some Nickel Creek sitting around the campfire tonight. I think would be okay. Yeah, right. You know, little on the other side, you know, mandolin picking maybe if the guitar is not there.
Nice.
All right. So the hardest question.
Oh no!
You are sitting by the campfire. Well, and now we're going to you, Elizabeth, since we started with Mike last time. You can take one. I always say philosopher, but I want to expand it up for you slightly.
I'm not the philosopher on this call.
Right. So I'm gonna give you a broader space. You can take one philosopher or public political figure, alive or dead.
Oh gosh.
Camping. Who do you take with you on that camping trip?
I mean, can I just say Jesus? Because doesn't he count as a philosopher? And
I think somebody who worked in the George W. Bush administration might get away with that answer and open herself up to all of the legitimate critique that he received when he gave it. But that's fine.
Okay, so I won't skip. Like, it's funny. I just had a conversation with my kids about this when they were like asking, you know, who would you want to go to dinner? Who would you want to have dinner with? And I'm like, the easy answer is always Jesus. It actually would be a really fascinating conversation.
It'd be fascinating.
And like, I mean, who's going to argue with you, right? So now here I am using it. Y'all, that's a great question.
Well, who is again, this is actually a serious question, but framed in this silly way. When you, as a person who is in the political space, like, who do you look at as inspirations for doing the kind of work you do? Like, who is it that you would want to spend time with in that kind of inspirational mode? Like, man, if I could pick their brain around that campfire, who would that be?
So you're asking it at an interesting time in my life, right? So I'm deconstructing everything that I was taught growing up because I found myself in 2015 going, wait a second, I thought we said that character matters, and now you're telling me character doesn't matter. So like moral majority politics, you know, all the things that conservatism was wrapped in turned out to not, it was about power, and it was not about any of their values.
Who possibly could have thought? Yeah.
Right. So I have this aha moment. No, I'm not the only person. And I spend a lot of time when an issue will come up and be like, well, I know what I was taught that the right answer. But is that the right answer? So I actually, I don't know, except I find myself discovering, you know, the writings of, this is going to sound trite, but Martin Luther King Jr.
No, that's
and
not trite.
how he created amazing change in this peaceful way. And I'm at the moment, very inspired by that. Not that he was perfect, but I mean, it just feels like that we're kind of in a similar moment where everybody is very tense. And I was in Selma back in November or October, and learning about how they trained to do civil disobedience. They practiced how to do it.
It's liturgical.
And yes, and I had no appreciation for that until this trip. And so it really has inspired me to think more deeply about, you know, how do you practice, the philosophy, if you will, this idea of loving our neighbor, turning the other cheek, like literally not just your cheek, like they were brutally beaten, and their response to that was, we're gonna keep showing up, and you can keep beating us because this is the right thing to do, and that so moves me. So maybe
I think it's
Jesus
a great
and Martin Luther King Jr.
Hey, that's a heck of a conversation. Fly on the wall with that. Sounds good to me. I actually wrote an essay. I don't know if it was 2016 or not. I think it may have been 2020. I think it was 2020. Called Militant Liturgies. And it's all about Martin Luther King, Soren Kierkegaard, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Simone Weil.
I would love to have Bonhoeffer too.
Bonhoeffer's amazing, right? And these four thinkers, and the whole point was, what does it look like to engage in liturgical practice in a religious community where you are militantly opposed to what passes as religion in your community?
Yes.
So religionless Christianity, this religion without religion.
Will you send this article to me?
I'll be happy to. Yeah,
it sounds awesome.
It was a lot of fun, and ironically, it got turned down in its early form. It was invited. It's like when you get invited stuff, it's like automatically accepted. They still turned it down and said, "This is too polemical." So unfortunately, the version that got published is still way too amenable to the things I was trying to be militantly liturgically opposed to, but it nonetheless works. So yeah, I'll send you a copy. All right, Mike, look at all this time we have given you. You better come correct, man.
You gotta have a better answer than me.
What philosopher are you taking with you?
The philosopher, it's going to be Kierkegaard, even though I haven't read a ton of him, just enough to so my experience with him, it was like a lot of people, he shows up in philosophy, religion, anthology as fideism, which of course, I don't think that's really what he was, at least not in the way they mean it. Because, the pseudonymous authors, all that stuff. But I read large sections of works of love, and actually wrote a small thing about Kierkegaard and Bono several years ago. But when I would when you read Kierkegaard, just actually just sort of talking in his own voice, and then I just want to ask him about a million questions about all that other stuff, what the heck does that mean, and what's this guy saying here, that this character you're inhabiting, and what do you think about it? All those kind of questions. But it just strikes. He strikes me as somebody who, it's easy for me to identify in certain ways because I take my Christian faith seriously. I think large parts of the institutional church are pretty jacked up, and I want to get back to what does it mean to follow the way of Jesus? In the Bonhoeffer sense, in my context, right? For me, it's not going to be the same as Kierkegaard or Bonhoeffer,
right?
But what does that mean for me and for us, my community?
Love it. Well, and as Mike knows, my recent book, Camping with Kierkegaard, maybe shows what it looks like maybe to go camping with Kierkegaard. So anybody who's interested, go grab a copy of that, now available in Audible, read by me. So if you haven't gotten enough of my voice tonight, do not get the Audible version. So my choice tonight, in light of our conversation about how to think about religion in non-nationalistic ways, I would take, these are philosophy adjacent. I read their work in my philosophy of religion classes and my intro to philosophy classes, but they would not describe themselves as philosophers. I would take Anne Lamott and Nadia Bolz-Weber, because I think the two of them model what it looks like to think productively about religion, and in particular Christianity, in ways that understand proximity to the other. And so, yeah, they'd be my campfire guests tonight. And if anybody happens listening to this to have contacts with either of them, we'd love to be put in touch so that maybe if we can't go camping, we can at least chat a little bit. So, well, this has been so fun. You guys absolutely rock my face. Mike, it makes me almost want to go write my Music Mondays for tomorrow about you two, though it probably won't happen because it seems to me it's like such a low hanging fruit. So we'll see. But if I do, Elizabeth, I will make sure to dedicate it to both of you as what it looks like to have bland musical tastes in one's middle ages. And I will talk about you two. So this has been so much fun. You both are amazing. Elizabeth, in all sincerity, I'm sure we disagree about a lot in political policy ways, but my goodness, I would think with you all day long and I would only be made better by it. Mike, thank you so much. As always, your work continues to be, I think, a model of what public intellectual scholarship can be. And congrats on the new book. I wish it nothing but success. To everybody listening, thank you so much for joining us on another episode of Campfire Philosophy with J. Aaron Simmons. Please do go get Elizabeth's new book. It is amazing, Kingdom of Rage. And then make sure that you pre-order Mike Austin's book, American Christian Nationalism. While you're over at Amazon or wherever books are sold, pick up a copy of Camping with Kierkegaard as well. And don't forget to stop by my Substack, Philosophy in the Wild. I do 2 posts a week and would love to have you join me there. Mike also has a Substack. I don't know if Elizabeth does. She's probably doing way more important things than sitting around in coffee shops pontificating about how people should think. But you guys, amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On the trail, for hiking with me a few miles more, for casting out your line into waters in which we both stand, for dropping in at the top and fist bumping me at the bottom, and for coming camping with me and Kierkegaard.